Hi, this is David Bedford. Welcome back to another clip where we're looking at Beatles history. And this becomes such a crucial day for the future of the Beatles. 6th of June 1962, the Parlophone audition, under contract, session, whatever it was, with George Martin. And the reason I say that is because it was accepted for years and years that this was just an audition. But then in his book of 2013, Mark Lewisohn wrote in Tune In that there was no doubt that the Beatles were already under contract. Now this changes absolutely everything, and it was a key piece of evidence that he had found which said the Beatles were already under contract. But were they? I wanted to take a second look and actually find out, were they under contract or was it an audition? Because actually it does change things, and I'll explain why in a few moments. What we know is that Brian Epstein and George Martin had got together at the beginning of May 1962. The Beatles, of course, are out at the Star Club in Hamburg. George Martin sends a contract to Brian, which commences from the 6th of June 1962 for a year. So Brian signs the contract and sends it back to Parlophone. In the meantime, Brian then sends a telegram out to Hamburg to the boys, have secured a contract for Parlophone, begin rehearsing new songs. So on the face of it, that says when George Martin sent a contract and Brian has told the Beatles out in Hamburg that he secured a contract, the evidence then that Mark Lewisohn had turned up was a red form, and this was used for having a session with musicians down at EMI and determine the fees, etc. Now that form suggests that the Beatles were under contract, and this changes what we'd previously thought about it. But still, is that right? Were they under contract? Because when questioned years ago, George Martin had said, well, hang on a sec, why would I have already signed them? I would never have done that. It's preposterous. And that's what made me think, well, hang on, have we got just a mixture of evidence, of conflicts? What actually went on? And were the Beatles under contract? Now, my friend calls me the Beatles detective because I like to forensically examine everything that goes on. So let's have a look at this. In my previous non-Beatle life, my pre-Beatle life, before I became a researcher and an author, I worked in insurance. So I did 2 qualifications, one in English law and one in contract law. So I know the basics of what makes a contract. But I thought, well, hang on, none of this makes sense. I don't think they're under contract. But there's no point just being my opinion because I'm not a trained lawyer. So I spoke to Peter Bounds, a former chief executive of Liverpool City Council, a very senior solicitor who's dealt with some of the most complex legal matters ever. So this would be meat and drink to him. And I said to him, okay, this is the evidence I've got. Do you think the Beatles were under contract? He said, for any valid contract, you must have a valid offer from one party, the acceptance of that offer by the other party, something called consideration. That just means each side has to bring something to the contract for it to be valid. But one of the crucial points that Peter made was that there also has to be an intention to create legal relations on both parts. So, on the face of it, George Martin has sent a contract to Brian. Brian signed it, sent it back. They've turned up and done the session. That sounds like offer acceptance and consideration. But the key thing is, did George Martin sign the contract at that time? Well, we'll look at that in just a moment. And crucially, did George Martin and Brian and the Beatles believe they were under a contract at that time? So I've already mentioned that when George Martin was confronted with this, he said, no, why would I have signed a group before I saw them? I wouldn't have done that. It's preposterous. So I looked for, what did the Beatles think? Well, Paul McCartney says, we were told that it was an audition for George Martin. George said the Parlophone audition was June 62. So they both called it audition. John said it all sounds great, but has the contract actually been signed, Brian? And Brian said, no, it's not signed, not yet. But I can tell you that George Martin was most impressed and has told me that he wants to go ahead and get on with some releases. So this is immediately after the session on the 6th of June. Again, Brian has said there was still no contract, and the Beatles and I left EMI full of hope, but without money or security. He didn't think they were under contract. Norman Smith, one of the engineers of the day, it was some kind of special artist test because George Martin turned up. And again, this is a bit of a sign that it wasn't a full recording test, because George Martin was only brought in at the last minute by one of the other engineers. Ron Richards actually ran the session. And Len Wood, who's the director of EMI, he'd written to Brian later in June and said, I believe George Martin has agreed to give the Beatles a recording test and was impressed with what he heard. He signed them to a contract and the rest is public knowledge. So what we also know is after the session, well, Judy Lockhart-Smith, on behalf of George Martin, sent the contract that Brian had signed off to the department within EMI who dealt with all this. There's a letter on the 18th of June 1962, which is in Mark Lewisohn's book, The Beatles Chronicles, which is a great reference book. And he says, I'm sending you this contract. It's now been signed by the secretary and witnessed. So this has been returned to George Martin, signed by EMI. Therefore, we know that sometime between the 6th of June and the 18th of June 1962, George Martin has made a decision and has decided to sign the contract. He sent it off for the secretary of EMI to formally sign and return it to him. For some reason then, there was a delay because George Martin didn't actually send the contract to Brian until mid-July. So, was it an audition? Were they under contract? I think legally we can prove that even though George Martin had made the offer of a contract and Brian had signed that contract, that wasn't a contract yet. They weren't under contract to each other. What did all the parties believe on the day? George Martin said it wouldn't be under contract. That's preposterous. All the Beatles have also said it was an audition. They didn't have the contract yet. And the evidence from that paperwork within EMI proves that they were not under contract. So it was an audition. Why is that important? This is the day that changes everything for Pete Best and for the Beatles. Because at the end of the session, George Martin says to Brian, says, if, and that's the important two-letter word, if we decide to give you a contract, I'm going to bring in my own drummer. I'm going to bring in a session drummer. He says that to Brian, who doesn't understand studio protocols. Brian then goes to John, Paul and George and says, right, George Martin doesn't think that Pete's good enough to play on the records. At that point then, John, Paul and George are left with the dilemma. What do we do? You know, Paul has said, we had no problems with Pete. He was great playing live. But if the producer says he's not good enough, we need to change him. At that point, they decide to replace Pete. Now, actually, they didn't need to, because all George Martin was saying is, don't mind what you do with them as a group, but for making the record, I'm going to bring in a session drummer. But this was the very last chance. Every other record company had turned the Beatles down. EMI had actually turned them down beforehand. George Martin, if he sends through the signed contract, this meant the Beatles finally had a contract, but Pete would not be with them. As John had said, you know, they were cowards the way they dealt with it. Now, the all ins and outs of how Pete was replaced, because it wasn't straightforward, that's the subject for another video. But for the 6th of June 1962, the Beatles turned up for an audition